Okay, I think we are ready to go. Get some notes up here. All right. So thank you everyone for making it. As I mentioned kind of in the little intro, I'm going to be talking about Azure Static Web Apps. This was a service announced by the Azure team back at Microsoft Build, which was, I think was in May or June. I can't remember exactly when it was. But it was announced and unveiled there and launched. So brand new service. And before we dive too deep into like the nitty gritties of the service, I want to talk about the problem that it's trying to solve and if it's the right service for you or if it would help you at all. So before we can answer that question, let's break down what a static web app is. It's kind of in the name of this service here. So a static web app is really just an application that doesn't have any, it doesn't mean it's an application that doesn't have any dynamicism. That comes from the term static. The opposite of static would be dynamic, but it doesn't mean that it's an app that's not dynamic. It's just an app that means it doesn't have a dynamic server necessarily, meaning that there's no code that runs on a server before your user actually sees your web application, right? That doesn't mean that there's not a server component at all. It's certainly possible that you might have kind of a REST API or even a GraphQL API that does run on a server. But the point being that when a user first visits your application, they go to yourapp.com, there's basically no server involved. They're just downloading static assets. So that's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and maybe images, videos, those kinds of things. And there's kind of like three categories to some degree of what can be classified as a static web app, or what I would classify as a static web app. Number one would just be a set of like static HTML files, right? Index.html, about.html, and you just link those two together, and that's kind of a static site, right? And then another might be like a single page application, right? Like a Vue.js app or a React application, or we're going to be using Angular tonight, so we're going to be building one of these single page applications, and that basically means that the initial request to your website, the response back is a simple HTML file. It's a handful of lines of HTML code, normally just like some script tags, some link tags to pull in some CSS, and that's it. And then the rest of the app boots up once all that JavaScript has been downloaded, and it's gonna go insert stuff into your web page. And as you click buttons, it'll take things out and put other things in. So the single page nature of it is just the fact that initially, there's just one HTML page that gets served up. No matter which URL you request, you get a single page back. Although most of these single page app frameworks, they have some notion of routing that happens in the browser, and you'll see your URL update, and it looks like separate pages, but it's not going back to the server to get each of those new pages necessarily. And then kind of the third category is kind of a little bit of an expansion on the very first one, where it's just some simple HTML files, but those HTML files are built at or compiled at a specific time. And these kind of fall into like what would be called a static site generator. So if anyone's heard of something like Jekyll or Hugo or Gatsby, these are all static site generators where you run some build command and it's gonna spit out a whole bunch. It's gonna take some code you wrote earlier and template that all out into a whole bunch of HTML files, right? Kind of the example with Gatsby is normally you have like maybe some markdown files living in a folder on your computer. And when you run your Gatsby build command, it's gonna pull all those out and convert them all to HTML for you and add all your extra headers and footers to your site and all that kind of stuff. And all three of those applications, all three categories of those applications will work perfectly fine with Azure Static Web Apps. It's kind of meant to support all three of those. Now, if you've ever dealt with these types of applications before, hosting them is actually normally pretty simple. If you have a server somewhere, maybe running Linux or probably even, I imagine Windows has all sorts of support for this too. You can normally just toss those built files on that server and have the web server just serve them up and you're good to go. And so why do you need Azure Static Web Apps? Why do we need a service to handle such a simple hosting problem for us? And it's because Azure is going to do a lot of really nice things that are slightly more difficult. So number one thing that Azure Static Web Apps is going to do for us is we're going to connect it to our source code. So if you are in the single page app category or the static site generator category and you need some kind of build step before your code can be finally delivered, Azure Static Web Apps will be responsible for actually running that build step before it deploys all that code to production. And then the second part I kind of hinted there, it'll also automatically deploy. You don't need to connect to a server and upload those files or anything like that. You simply just push your code to GitHub and Azure will take care of the rest. It's going to do the build, it's going to do the deploy. And then on top of that, the other real nice thing that Azure is going to do automatically for you is, since these are all static assets, you can hook them up to what's called a CDN. If you've never heard of a CDN, the basic idea is that if you deploy your website to a server on the West Coast, but you have users on the East Coast, the users on the East Coast are going to have a subpar experience because they're going to have, their browsers and devices are going to have to connect to your servers on the West Coast, download all that data, all those files, which can take a minute. And so the idea behind a CDN is that it normally only deals in static assets like simple HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and images and whatnot. And it basically makes copies of them on multiple servers throughout the world, so that when a user visits your site, it will intelligently route the request to the server that's closest to them. And what's really nice about the Static Web App service is that it will automatically handle all that CDN stuff for you without you doing anything. Just by deploying to Azure Static Web Apps, your app is globally distributed, as they like to say, which handles a lot of scale problems for you, because that's definitely an issue that I imagine many companies who start local and get really big run into, and is that their clients in the UK have a really terrible experience accessing their website or their application. And so this service kind of handles that for us too. So for tonight, I have a simple Angular application. It's full of kind of just some nonsensical stuff, just to kind of prove some of the points and some of the key features that I want to show off. But I have it all in this GitHub repo, and I will open source this either later tonight or sometime tomorrow once I get a chance to put together a nicer README. And so you can come look at all these examples. But here's all of our source code essentially, right? And then back in Azure, I've gone to portalazure.com. I already have my own account, all that kind of stuff. I'm gonna just search for static web apps up here in the search bar. And you'll notice right off the bat, it says static web apps preview. That's a point I kind of want to touch on. This is a service that is in preview. A better word might be beta. This is beta software. It's not 100% ready for production. The stuff I kind of outlined earlier with the global CDN and building and deploying your code, from what I've seen, that stuff is actually really solid. And I would feel decent about putting a small to medium-sized project on it and having it be production ready. But some of these more kind of nicety features, more advanced features I'm going to show off, they aren't ready for prime time by any means, but they make for a cool demo and they're nice for maybe like some internal tools or something like that. And then the other thing I want to mention, and this is kind of the biggest reason that I would say maybe stay away from production, is they haven't released any pricing information on this service yet, meaning that for now it's completely free, but at some point in the future, they may take the rug out from underneath you and start charging you for it. Now, there is a competitor to this service that some of you may have heard of. They buy ads on every dev podcast I listen to, it seems like, but Netlify is kind of a competing service to this. And Netlify still maintains a free tier. And so I would imagine to stay competitive with Netlify, they will probably maintain some form of a free tier. But for now, it's completely free, although there are some limitations that we'll get into towards the end. So depending on your scale, even this free version won't work for you potentially if you're serving up lots and lots of traffic. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into actually setting up the service. So I already have one set up called sgf.net. This is the one we're going to be using. So I'm not actually going to create a new resource here, but I'm going to walk through all the steps and show it off real quick. So you go to add, and you got to choose your subscription and put it in some resource group. And then you give it some name. And this is purely just an internal name to Azure. And you choose what region you want to deploy this to. As far as I know, I'm not 100% sure what this region actually affects because the whole thing should be globally distributed. It could be that the global distributed part of it is actually coming in the future and not 100% ready, and that's why you have to choose a region, but it's something I haven't 100% confirmed yet. And then the next part is you sign in with GitHub. So I mentioned earlier that we were going to connect this service to our source code, and the way we do that is through GitHub. So they don't support any other source code provider or source repository providers. So no Bitbucket, no GitLab, they just support GitHub. Once again, it's a preview service. This may be something that they change, but for now, we're stuck with GitHub. So you sign in with your GitHub account, which I've already done. You choose your organization. This one is in my personal account. You choose your repository, and you choose which branch you want to deploy from. And what's important about this is every time a new commit shows up in this branch, it's going to run a build and deploy automatically. Now, there is a way you can like cancel a build if you didn't actually mean to do that. But by default, this is the behavior. So then we'll go to the next step here, and it's asking for kind of some build information. This is kind of like some project specific information. The first thing is it needs our app location. And what this is asking for is essentially the folder in that repository that our app lives in. So if I go back to my GitHub repo, I have this folder here called app. And this is where all of the Angular source code lives. So back in Azure, I need to make sure to put app there because that's the folder everything is living out of. Next, it says API location, which I haven't touched on this yet, but this service automatically supports having a folder full of Azure functions that it will automatically manage in your Azure account for you and deploy every time that you push a new update to your site. Now, I do have some of those in here that live in a folder called API. And so it kind of fills that in by default, but you would want to make sure to fill that in here. And then the last thing that it needs is this app artifact location. And what that is asking for is normally if you run some kind of build, it's going to put all the results or the artifacts in a certain folder in your project. And so for an Angular application, let me pop open my editor here. This might be a little bit hard to see, but I have this dist folder with this sgf.net Azure Static Web Apps. And this is kind of the default structure that Angular uses for its projects. And this is all the static built assets. So that's what I need to enter. Dist /sgf.net, or I think it was .net Azure Static Web Apps. Now, that folder is technically inside of the app folder from the root of my repository, but I don't have to prefix it with app. So it assumes that this directory you're listing here is in your app directory, or in this app location, or yeah, app location field. Then you can enter in some tags. You could review and create it. Okay, yeah, it's giving me an error because I've already deployed this thing, and so it's not going to let me, but there would be, this create button would show up as blue here. You click it, it would take a few seconds to spin up some stuff in Azure, and then the next thing that you would notice after the stuff in Azure had been created is if you go back to GitHub and look at your commits, I'll have to scroll back a little bit, Microsoft will actually make a commit into your repository. And what it's doing in this commit, let me just pull it up here, is it adds this GitHub workflows directory, and then it adds in this YAML file. And this YAML file is basically, this is a GitHub action. If you've never heard of GitHub actions, it's basically continuous integration, continuous deployment built into GitHub. And you define all the steps to build and test your code using these workflow files. And so almost all of the Azure Static Web Apps like build and deployment logic lives inside of here. At least a portion of it lives in here. It actually pulls in like a third-party workflow file from Microsoft. But the point being that you can go see all of that code. None of it is hidden in Azure. Azure isn't like cloning your repo into their servers, doing a whole bunch of magic to it, and then deploying it. all that stuff actually runs on GitHub's servers. But in here, you can see like the settings we chose earlier are all in here. So like the app location, the app artifact location. So if you need to change those settings, you actually come to this workflow file and edit them. You don't go back to Azure. In fact, there's no option in Azure to go edit those settings. If you change them, you will actually make a commit to your project updating this file. And then there's some other stuff in here. Like I said, it pulls in an additional workflow file from Microsoft, this Azure Static Web Apps deploy workflow file, and some other stuff we won't get into. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting, and this is what tripped me up when I first started using this service, is that at no point did I tell the service how to actually build my code. I just kind of told it where a couple things were. But it still works. So like it instantly deployed the site and everything was working just fine. So it was a little bit of a head scratching moment. But after digging in through the workflow files, it turns out that Microsoft is pulling in this project called Microsoft, I think it's pronounced Oryx, O-R-Y-X. Don't quote me on that. Never heard it pronounced out loud before. But basically, this is a project to automatically detect what kind of technologies your project is using and build them. So in our instance, since it's an Angular application, which is in turn a Node.js application, it's going to look for a package.json file in that app location folder. And if it finds one, it's going to run a script in there called build. So if I jump over to the package.json in my code, oops, and let's just go into presentation mode so you guys can see all this. So in here, I have this script called build. And you can access any of these scripts by saying npm run and then the name of the script. And so this Microsoft Oryx project, which is built on top of Docker, it runs in a GitHub action. It pulls in all the code. It looks in that directory for a package.json. If it finds it, it's going to look for a script called build and run it. And so basically, if you want anything to happen on deployment or on build by the service, you make sure to add that in here. And you can basically chain together several commands if you need them all to run. And so that's kind of something that might make you scratch your head when it works or doesn't work for some odd reason when you didn't actually give it any settings. This is something that especially tripped me up because I've used the competing Netlify service quite a lot. And they do have a special text field where you enter in your build command. And so I was expecting something like that and didn't see it. At this point, I believe that the Oryx project supports Python, Node, and C#, I believe. So if you're using any of those tools to build out your static assets, they should work with Oryx. You'll probably have to dig into the Oryx documentation to figure out what exactly you need in the right place to actually get everything to work. But anyways, and then at this point, if we made another commit into our project, it would automatically deploy. So let me go back into the service here, and we'll pull up our URL. It automatically assigns you a URL. So right here is the URL to our project. So if we click that, our Angular application will be running. Boom. So there's our Angular app. I'll get into why I have a random table and all this stuff in there a little bit later. Jumping back over to the portal, kind of the next thing I want to cover is this custom domains section. So by default, it assigns you some very random looking URL that you can't customize at all, which is pretty obtuse if you want to have something friendly for your users to actually type in and get to your application with. So they have this custom domains feature where you come in here, you add some kind of domain. So I own levizitting.com, so I could say Azure, or we'll just call it SWA for Static Web Apps, .levizitting.com. And I could add this in. Before I do that, they actually have some instructions up here for the DNS records I would need to go update. So they're telling me to go add a www CNAME record pointing to this. I do believe that I could also point, instead of www, have whatever subdomain that I wanted there, and it should still work. Could be wrong though. Yeah, I haven't actually tried looking with this. It might be entirely possible that only the www one works, because once it recognizes that this domain is connected, it will automatically generate an SSL certificate for you. So that's another thing that this service completely manages. You don't have to worry about dealing with SSL certificates with this service. Now, one thing that I noticed pretty early on was that they only support the www here. They don't support the apex or root domain. So if I want to just levizitting.com to point to it, I'm kind of a little bit SOL there. Although there are some alternatives depending on your DNS provider. So one alternative is to simply just do a redirect. So like if you have a server that you can set aside to handle redirects, or if your DNS provider supports it, you can basically adjust it so that the root domain redirects to the www version. And then also, if your DNS provider supports it, like if you are with Cloudflare or name.com, they have some alternative records that allow you to basically point Cname records at the root. So it's a little bit of a complicated problem that I'll dive into very, very briefly. But the DNS specification does not allow you to create Cname records for the root domain, which means that you can't, and the whole purpose of a Cname is to say this domain actually just kind of pulls in this domain instead. And then the alternative record type would be like an A record, where you say this domain points to this IP address, which is very different than another domain. But the DNS specification says that root domains can't be these Cname records. They have to be A records. And so name.com has these A name records is what they call them. And Cloudflare has what they call Cname Flattening, where you can actually give it what looks like a Cname, and it will go find the IP address of that domain and represent it as A records to the outside world. So there is some workarounds here. In the README that I put together, I'll provide a link to a blog post that walks through like adding your domain into Cloudflare, setting up all the proper Cname flattening stuff to actually make your root domain work with Azure Static Web Apps. This is also something that the team behind this service has said that like it's on their roadmap to fix. They understand that this is not a great solution for everyone. It's kind of something you end up having to deal with a preview/beta service. So something to be aware of with the custom domain stuff. Okay. So honestly, that's kind of like all that there is to, like, that's kind of the 80% of this service, if you will. You connect it to your GitHub repo, you push, you deploy. It's supposed to be really, really simple. But there are some additional features here that I thought were kind of awesome. And it's something that I kind of see with Netlify, but they do it in a slightly more interesting way. And then also I wanted to talk about the Azure Functions stuff as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is authentication. So this service actually has like a built-in way to handle authenticating your users. And they do this by integrating with social providers. So you can do like a login with GitHub, Twitter, Facebook, Google, and Azure Active Directory. So they support 5 different like login types, and you can support as many or as little as you want. So in this Angular application, if I go into the source directory, app, and app component.ts. So I'm not going to dive too deep into all of this code. Most of it's kind of just default Angular stuff anyways. But I do have this, this user property on my component, and this is basically a property in a component means that I can use that in a template to do some logic, right? So I have this user property that's supposed to represent an authenticated user. And I have this lifecycle method here called ng-on-init. And this basically runs the first time this component gets booted up and is displayed on the screen. And in here, I use this authService.getUser function that I wrote, which I'll dive into that one in a second, to go and grab the currently authenticated user. And then if we go look at the template here, go up to the top, this is using Angular Material, which is just a kind of front-end CSS framework for component library is the better word for Angular. See if I can move this thing out of the way. So there's some kind of complicated markup in here, but the main thing is that this first part, this mat drawer, or mat side nav, sorry, this is a sidebar that comes out in our application. And in there we have some links to some other pages. And then we have this if statement here. So ng if user equals null. So if the user is null, then we spit out a couple links saying log in with GitHub or log in with Twitter. And if the user is not null, that means someone's actually logged in here. And we instead display hello and their username or and a log out button, right? So the first thing to note here is this anchor tag here, although it has some additional attributes on it, has an href pointing to /auth/login/GitHub. And this is a URL that exists when our application is deployed to Azure Static Web Apps that Azure manages all on its own. And if a user clicks on this link, they'll get taken to that URL. They'll be shown a GitHub authorize this app page. If they click allow, they'll be sent back to your app and they will be logged in. Now, how you check the status of whether they're logged in or not is through an API call. So if we go back to our app component, there was this auth service I was talking about that has this get user function. If I jump over to get user, basically it makes a HTTP GET request to .auth/me. And this, the API endpoint returns this object with a client principal, which basically has the user object on it. And this will be null if the user is not logged in. And so in here, there's a little bit of code that checks to see if that property is null. If it is null, or if there's an error with the response, we just return null, which I'm using to denote a logged out user. If it's not null, that means there's a logged in user, and there will actually be like some additional properties that have like a user ID on there that Azure actually generates for us, as well as their permissions. Once you actually go look at the user, there's a users page in the Azure Static Web Apps dashboard where you can see all the users that have signed into your app. And you can give them different roles and permissions. And then those will be on there as well. And then, well, let's just go look. So if I go look at the iUser model I set up. Oh, identity provider. So it'll say if they logged in with Facebook or if they logged in with GitHub or whatever. So let's go back to the app here. And let's open up this sidebar. And first, one thing I'll say is that there will be some data. Actually, let's go to the about page and do this. Well, didn't code that in there. So some data will show up in this table, and I'll explain what that data is in a little bit. The point being that data requires a user to be signed in to even be able to retrieve. And so you'll kind of see that in action, but we'll dive into that in a few minutes. But I'll go ahead and log in with GitHub. Now, it took me to a GitHub page where I've already clicked accept, and then it sent me back. So if I open up the sidebar, you'll see my GitHub username is there with the log out button. And so now I'm signed in. And if I refresh the page here with the DevTools open, we should be able to see that network request to that auth/me route. So right in here, this might be a little hard to see, but we have this client principal object. The identity provider is GitHub, user ID, user roles, so on and so forth. And that's about all it gives you. It tries to keep it fairly simple there. But then you could use that user ID and send it to your API and have it protect or access, some bits of data or whatever you need there. Okay. And then when you hit log out, it takes you to another URL where it officially logs you out, and you're good to go. So that's honestly probably the easiest authentication setup I've ever seen, where you just send them to a URL and you're done. There are some downsides here, and this also gets into, this is beta software we're working with here. I wish that I wouldn't have clicked accept on the Twitter one so that I could show you somewhat of what this looks like. But basically, when they go to that authorize screen from the social provider, it will say, no matter what the name of your Azure app is, it will say Azure Static Web Apps wants your consent or something like that. And so basically what Azure has done is they've gone through the process of entering in all the various information to these social providers to get their app approved, and you're just hijacking that. I imagine at some point, this may be kind of a much farther down the road, they will allow you to go manage all that on your own so that you can have a nice screen that says your app. Because it would be confusing for most users to see Azure Static Web Apps wants to access your account. And they're like, I was on a coffee shop website. What? Like, no, this sounds like a scam, right? So I imagine that is something that they'll change in the future. But once again, the thing that keeps coming to mind for me is like internal tools, right? Like if this is like an internal tool, that seems like a perfectly fine thing to have your users go through. And also, one of the limitations that I was going to mention later, but I'll mention now, is I believe there's a limit of 25 registered users. So once again, it kind of keeps you, for now, in the free tier. So that kind of gets you back into, you know, that internal tool type space where only a handful of people need to access this app, but it needs to be secured, yada, yada, yada. So that was authentication. Now I want to talk a little bit about routing. So one thing that this service supports is basically kind of providing it a list of some rules around your URLs. So you can basically say, like, if someone requests this URL instead, send them over to this URL. So it's a way to do like some simple 301, 302 redirects. But it can also do a handful more things there. So like one thing that people run into when they build these single page web applications all the time is, you know, the app requests a single HTML file from the server, and then it takes over and it's doing all this client-side routing, changing the URL and all that stuff. And you can actually kind of see that in action here. If I hit this about and just go to this about page, my URL up here adjusted to /about. Now, the thing that you can run into in many instances is if a user refreshes at this point, now instead of requesting the root URL that they were when they initially landed on your site, they're actually trying to access like a different URL from your server, which is different than the client-side routing, right? And so normally when you're dealing with a single page application, you need what they call a fallback route, where basically if any route gets requested, send back this same HTML file, because all the actual routing logic lives in my client-side code. And so there's a way to, through this routes option in that Azure lets you provide them, you can, you know, create like a fallback route, right? So down here, I have this routes.json file, and I'll show you where to put this in a second. But down here at the very bottom, I have this route/wildcard, which basically means any URL. I want you to serve up the index.html file from Angular with this status code. You know, I have a few others in here, which I can actually touch on really quick. So one thing I didn't add in my app was the ability to log in with Facebook or Google. There was only a GitHub or Twitter login, right? But if some user was really smart, they could just type in /auth/login/Facebook and log in with their Facebook account. And so I'm overriding that in here by saying that that specific URL that Azure has built in should 404 instead of actually letting them log in with Facebook, because I'm trying to limit it here. I probably should have also added one for Azure Active Directory, I suppose, too. And then over here, I also have just kind of like a nicety redirector. This isn't even a redirect. This is a like a proxy type thing, if you will. So basically, if anyone ever hits /logout, it'll hit .auth/logout, right? So it just makes it so that I have a little bit nicer URLs. So I could rewrite most of my login URLs to be /login/GitHub instead of .auth login GitHub. And then this one, we'll get into a little bit with the API, but this is just kind of a quick and dirty way to do some level of authentication against your API. So right here, I'm saying any requests to API, users have to be authenticated. If they're not, the server will automatically return a 401 unauthorized. And now where do you put this file, this routes.json file? Basically, this file needs to be in that artifact location, in the root of that artifact location. Now, with Angular, that is that dist sgf.net at Azure Active, or the project name folder, right? Which I don't commit that to my repository, because those are ephemeral files as far as I'm concerned. They can disappear at any time and all be good. my GitHub action is responsible for creating those. But most of these frameworks have some folder that you can drop static assets in that just gets simply copied over there at some point. And so in Angular, that is this assets directory. So in assets, I have my routes.json. And I could put all sorts of stuff in there, like images and videos, and all that stuff will get copied over as well. And most of the frameworks have most of the frameworks with build tools, at least, have some concept of a copy over directory. Most of them aren't coming to mind right now, but a lot of them will call them like public or something like that. That's a name you hear pretty often, is a public directory. And then to do a true redirect, because like this one, where I have like a nicer URL here for this logout, that won't actually be a redirect. The request to logout will just happen through and no URLs will change at any point. But if you did want to do a redirect, you would just simply come in here and add a status code of 301 or 302, and it would treat it like a full-blown redirect at that point. Any questions so far? Okay. Let me know if I'm going too fast, because we're flying through this. I'm actually almost done. Okay, so the last thing I was going to talk about was the Azure Functions integration. So back in my GitHub repo, I have this API folder, and in here is all the code for my Azure Functions. Now, how you can, there is kind of some setup code. So let's like jump in here. There's I have this get data function. It's very very generic, and then I have a couple other files here, a package.json, proxies.json, and if I go into get data, I have a few other things in here. Some of these don't actually. I think that sample.dat can actually disappear. But the point being, I didn't go manually create all of these files. I am way too lazy to do that. So, oops. We navigate to, or here, let's open this up here. Oh boy. What happened there? Oh, I think I accidentally stopped screen sharing. That's what happened. Oh. Thank you. Let me double check that the recording is still going.
Yeah, it's still
recording.
Cool. All right. So back in WebStorm, let me open up VS Code really quick. And the reason I'm opening up VS Code is because Microsoft has some tooling for automatically generating all this stuff, but it lives in, it's an extension that's only available for VS Code, and I'm using WebStorm here. So let me open this up in VS Code. And what you're looking for in VS Code, close some of this stuff down, is the Azure Functions extension. So you would install this extension, and then you would open up the command palette, which for me is Command-Shift-P, and type Azure Functions create new project. And then you give it a directory on your computer to generate this project into. So I'll browse and let's create a new one. And oh, geez, no, I do not want to put it there. Let's create another one in here called API2 or something like that to just generate all this stuff. Delete. I'm going to do a directory, API2. Okay, so now let's try this Azure Functions create new project. We'll go to browse, API2, we'll select. We say what language. As far as I know, right now, the Azure Static Web Apps only supports JavaScript. They don't support any other languages for the Azure Functions integration. If you know a little bit about TypeScript tooling, you could easily do a TypeScript project and just run a build step before you, or as a part of your, there should be a way to edit that workflow file to like build the TypeScript code into JavaScript code for your Azure function before it gets deployed. And that would totally work. But for now, we'll just go with JavaScript. You want to choose HTTP trigger. And then this is the name of your first function, right? So we'll say get messages or something like that. And then you need to provide an authorization level for your function. And you want to provide anonymous, which means anyone from the internet can hit this. Now, even if you want to protect this function, you'll still use anonymous here because these other options, as far as I know, are more like functions that can only be accessed from other Azure services instead of from the web as a whole. So you would choose anonymous here, and it generated all that stuff for me. It generated this index.js file with a little bit of server-side code, some sample data, and then all these other bits and pieces here. And then if you deployed this, it would automatically be picked up by Azure and deployed as an Azure function. One thing I ran into when I was trying to work with this, and it may be just because I don't totally understand like the Azure Functions framework about how to name your functions, but I did have to come into functions.json and add a route here. And I'll actually just go ahead and delete this. And we'll look at our API folder here and look at functions.json. So yeah, I had to add a route here with what I wanted the URL for this function to be. And automatically, any Azure functions that get deployed with this service live under /API. So to run this specific index.js file, I would go to /API /data. And if you remember back over here in our route definition, I said everything under API required an authenticated user. And so if we jump into a little bit of Angular code here again, I'll go to providers, or sorry, I'll go to pages, homepage, home component. In here, I'm pulling in this data service, and on init, I use that data service to fetch some data. It's all very, very generic stuff. And then at the end, this is a little bit of code to basically push that data into that big table that was shown up there before. And if we go look at the data service.getData, it's just an HTTP GET request to /API /data. And then once again, if we look at our routes.json one more time, everything under API routes needs this authenticated role, which automatically gets assigned to every user that signs up through the authentication service. Which if you wanted to have more granular permissions, once again, you can manually control all these permissions from the dashboard. And don't quote me on this, but there might even be ways to programmatically from your Azure function add additional roles onto some users. I could be wrong about that though. So now if we jump back over to our browser and look at the application itself, and I go to the home page, you'll see no data is coming in. And if we look at the dev tools, we're actually getting a 401 to API /data because we're not authenticated. And then at this point, if I log in with GitHub and wait just a second, boom, all of our data comes in. It's a 1,000 rows of data, so it definitely takes a second. And it's just some bogus like account data with some fake phone numbers and emails that all gets piped into this table. So that is the Azure function integration. Once you're in an Azure function, you can do just about anything that you want, right? Like you can connect to a database and start writing data into that database or pulling data out of that database. And you can, it supports all the basic HTTP verbs, so you can send delete, post, put requests, all you want. And then the last thing I wanted to pull up here was this limitations documentation, or what they call quotas. So basically, every month you have 100 gigabytes of bandwidth. And what counts as bandwidth is whenever someone requests your site, Azure uses a little bit of data to transfer those files to that person. And that's what gets calculated as the bandwidth, right? So if your site is 10 megabytes in size, right, and you have 100 users, then you're going to be using 1,000 megabytes for those 100 users. Now, the good news is most of the time, when any user visits your site, the browser is going to cache a lot of this data for it. And so it doesn't have to request those every time someone gets onto your site. So depending on your scale though, like this might turn into a problem, right? If you have like massive Facebook levels of traffic, then maybe this isn't the right service for you. And there is no overage bandwidth available right now. I am certain that will change. Apps per Azure subscription 10, so that means you can only have 10 of those apps listed in your account. They do have a limit on app size, so all of your static assets have to be under 100 megabytes. And what that means to me is that like if you're building an app with a lot of videos or something like that, don't host your videos in your app. Because number one, it's going to make you go over that app size. And number two, it's going to use up more and more of that bandwidth. So maybe punt that off to, what's the Azure storage service? Can't remember. Or the equivalent of like, you know, Amazon S3 or something like that. Some storage service that'll just store large files for you. Pre-production environments. I actually forgot to mention this one. We can go back to that. You can only have one custom domain on your account at once. And yeah, then this authorization. Oh, okay. So I think you can actually have unlimited users for your app, but there's a maximum of 25 users that you can add custom roles to, and 25 users that you can invite, because that's something I also didn't show off. But if I go back to role management here, this should be the users on my site, and I can invite users based on their email or their like Facebook or GitHub usernames, and invite them into the system automatically, so they don't have to go through any account creation phase, and they'll automatically have, you know, these base roles. And so there's limits to you can only have 25 of those, and I believe these are per account limits. So like across your Azure subscription, you can only have 25 of these users. Yeah, I think that's it. That's the main limitations right now. Once again, pricing is subject to change at any point. They say that they'll give everyone a 30 days heads up when pricing does change. I would imagine that like what they're listing here is going to be similar to what their free tier is. Just kind of based on like, these are kind of similar to what the competing service Netlify offers in terms of what's available in their free plan. The last bit that I said I would get back to is this pre-production environments. And basically, this is the equivalent of like a staging site. So when you open a pull request against your repository, Azure will create a copy of your site at a different URL that has all the changes in that pull request. So you can easily go view that pull request and all its changes. But it looks like you're only allowed to have one of those. Yeah, it's a little confusing if these are like account-wide or app-wide. So not sure if like it's one pre-production environment per your whole account or just specific to a project. But yeah, that's really handy if you want to easily be able to test someone's changes before they merge them into your project. Azure will just update the pull request with a comment that has a link to the staged version of the code. But yeah, that is Azure Static Web Apps. It's a pretty slick little service. I'm really excited to see where the team takes it from here. Because they've thoroughly impressed me with how easy that authentication stuff was. And if they can make some adjustments there to make it so it's a little bit more customizable and can show, you know, your company name instead of Azure Static Web Apps on those sign-in screens, then yeah, it'll be a home run. I'm also a big fan of like the routing stuff. One of the options I didn't show off was they also have some additional options in there to like handle 404s with like a special 404.html, so you can program that stuff in there too. And so yeah, I'm sure they will add all sorts of new features in the coming months. But that's the gist for now, basically. So yeah, any questions from the room or the Zoom?
No, that's cool.
Yeah. Okay, let me go ahead and stop the recording.